common evidence that's used to prove liability or fault in truck crash cases. So I think the first and most important piece of evidence in a truck crash case to prove liability is the crash report. So after a crash happens, police are typically called to the scene. They should be called to the scene, and there'll be a lead investigator. And depending on the severity of the crash, the officer may have additional officers out there and helping him out. I mean, those officers could be trained in things like accident reconstruction or other areas specific to an investigation. So the officer will come to the scene, and one of the first things he'll do is speak with the drivers involved in the crash. And he'll take statements from each. He'll listen to what they have to say, perhaps ask some questions of them. And those are critical pieces of evidence that determine how a police officer decides who is at fault in a crash. So the officer will then, of course, look at the position of the vehicles, where they came to a rest. And the officer will look for things like gouge marks in the road. And a gouge mark is a mark in the pavement that it will indicate where the point of impact actually happened. The officer will also look at what are called debris fields, which means when a crash happens, oftentimes parts of the vehicles will come off, or the bumpers will shatter, and so the officer will look to see where debris is at the point of impact as well as nearby the point of impact. Depending on the severity of a truck crash, the police officer will call out additional personnel to help. If there's a fatality, for instance, in the state of Texas, DPS troopers will be called to the scene because of their additional training in investigating crashes. And a specific type expert or officer that they'll call to the field is someone who's got a specialty in accident reconstruction. And that accident reconstructionist will do things like take photos of skid marks, of gouge marks, of debris fields. The accident reconstruction will also take a series of measurements and gather as much evidence as possible so that that person can ultimately put together how the crash happened. Another critical piece of evidence is data from what's called the black box. And the black box, it's an electronic control module. Pretty much every vehicle that's been manufactured after a certain point of time and in recent years has got one of these ECMs or black boxes inside it. What that black box or ECM will do is record data that leads up to a time of a crash, to a point of impact, as well as information and data after the point of crash. After a serious truck crash, oftentimes the data from the truck's black box or electronic control module will be downloaded. So the black box data will show in part when the truck driver applied his brakes, how long before the impact, whether the truck driver applied the brakes at any time before the impact or at the time of the impact or ever. Additional information includes drivers' hours of service logs. And what does that mean? So federal regulations and also state regulations require drivers to only drive and be on duty for a certain period of time, after which they've got to take a break. They've got to be off for a period of time. And truck drivers are allowed to drive only so many hours in a 7-day or an 8-day period, depending on the state. In recent years, these drivers' hours of service logs, they are recorded electronically. Years ago, all of these driver's logs were required to be and were maintained by the truck driver himself. And as you can imagine, oftentimes those driver's logs, when they're manually created, well, they're subject to a little bit of fudging. In other words, maybe they're not always so accurate. So the benefit of electronic driver's logs nowadays is that it's much more difficult for truck drivers and trucking companies to alter or modify the hours of service logs. So what we do is we really get a better and more accurate snapshot of how long the truck driver was driving and whether he was complying with federal regulations and state regulations. So photographs also are a critical piece of evidence in helping to prove liability in a truck crash case. Photographs of the vehicles, property damage of the roadway, for instance, where the truck was coming from, what it looks like. Was it over a hill? Was it a flat straightaway leading up to the point of the crash? Whether there was an intersection nearby, whether there were any obstructions, any construction in the area. So photographs, they capture, of course, what is physically at a scene at the time of the crash, as well as after the crash and during the investigation. And that's super helpful evidence in proving liability in a truck crash case. In addition, videos of the crash scene can be very helpful. In truck crash cases, as a part of our investigation, we do a Freedom of Information Act request, or in Texas, it's called a Public Information Act request, to whether it's DPS or the sheriff's office or whatever police department it is that investigated the crash. And we'll ask, of course, for the crash report, and we'll ask for any notes that were created by the investigating officers that are part of the file. Oftentimes, there are also witness statements that are written out, and they're a part of the police file. And unless a formal request is made for the entire file from the investigating police department, which is why it is our policy to request the entire investigative file from the investigating police force. So as a part of the file that we get from the investigating police officer includes oftentimes body cam video. And nowadays, most officers wear body cameras as well as a little microphone as well. And when an officer arrives at a crash scene, and especially if it's a serious crash like a truck crash, that officer will activate the body cam video as well as the audio, oftentimes before he or she even arrives at the scene, and then certainly once they get to the scene and get out of their vehicle and start the investigation. So everything that they do, and everything that they say and everything that they hear can be captured on this body cam video, which is critical to helping prove liability or prove fault in a truck crash case. So if you have any additional questions about how to prove liability or fault in a truck crash case, please don't hesitate to pick up the phone and give us a call at the Callahan Law Firm. Our phone number is 713-224-9000, or you can submit a contact form through our website, which is thecallahanlawfirm.com. We'll be glad to talk with you and discuss the facts of your case and what it is that we can do to help.